So there are lots of risks around choices that members make. And previously, you would have a board of trustees who had an advisor sitting with them making these choices. And those choices have now been passed on to individuals who have a lot of other choices that they're making in their lives.
Yes, and are maybe not as informed to make those decisions.
And who might not have access to a financial advisor, because a lot of our financial advice models are built around someone selling you something. Yeah, if someone can't sell you something, they're not necessarily going to be interested in giving you advice. So there are a lot of risks to the individual in the defined contribution space. And what's interesting are conversations around the world where people are going, well, actually, maybe we need to swing more, back more towards the defined benefit side. And there's a growing popularity, in countries like the Netherlands and Canada around what are called defined ambition funds, which are funds that are RDC.
Okay.
So you put in your contribution rate, but actually they track a certain retirement benefit, which might look like 75% of your pre-retirement salary. And if we could see that your projected value is drifting away from that, there are corrective measures within the fund to try.
Okay, so it's more proactive.
Yeah, so it's more monitored. It's trying to share the risks a bit more, or at least trying to manage some of the risks that the members face a bit better. So there are big conversations in the retirement space around risks and risk sharing, and more generally in the social security space. Okay, so where should individuals have to bear risks, and where should those risks be borne for them?
Yeah. And tell me, from an actuary's perspective, it's very clear that an actuary would have a role in the defined benefit space where you constantly are managing that risk. What is the actuary's role in the defined contribution space where the risk has been passed on to the individual? Does it become more like an investment conversation, or are there other risks that the actuary sort of is proactive in helping inform the pension fund around?
That's definitely gone through a bit of a journey as well. I would say that initially there was this belief that if you're in a defined contribution fund, you don't really need an actuary. But defined contribution funds can and do become insolvent. The reason being that your liability in a defined contribution fund doesn't magically always equal the assets. There has to be an administration process around making those two things match. And there are definite operational risks. So to give an example, assets change value all the time. It's a constantly moving target, but most administration systems really only run overnight. Okay, so if you have a massive asset movement during the day, which can definitely happen, and a member puts in an exit, there's some slippage in there.
Okay.
And so you can definitely have that happen. And you can also have errors. Errors happen all the time in every type of financial services. And there has to be some mechanism to try and catch them. So for a long time, you had a lot of valuation exempt funds where they actually really just signed off every couple of years that they were being audited correctly. But a lot of clients really began to see value in having actually do their valuation more often. So certainly when I was a consultant, I had some clients who had their valuations done annually. There's only a 3-year requirement, but they really saw value in having someone look at their funds on an annual basis and go, right, okay, here's your major area of operational risk. I can see this is what's going wrong. I can see members are making suboptimal choices in this area. Okay, let's look at our communication to them. Let's look at, behavioral elements of your fund and see how we can make this work better. Let's see how we can redesign your employee benefits to get, as an employer to achieve more of what you want. So there's definitely a lot of actuarial involvement there. Actuaries also involved in the investment side. It's a huge area. Obviously, if funds aren't valuation exempt, you're going to need an actuary to sign off on your triennial valuation. You need an actuary to sign off anyway on financial statements every year in a defined contribution fund. And there's really a lot of interesting work if you look at it from the member perspective. In the defined contribution space.
That's very helpful. I think something I would like to define for our listeners is what is the difference between a pension fund and a provident fund? I think these words are thrown out. And you also spoke about how there's this element of having to have an annuity as opposed to having to cash out or being allowed to cash out your full pension. Why is that even a conversation? Like, why can't I just take my money and, be done with it? Why is there that element of annuity that's being encouraged and almost putting into legislation?
Okay, so let's start talking about incentives. So in South Africa, we have what's called an exempt tax system, which means that the contributions that you put into your retirement fund are exempt from tax up to a certain amount. Then the roll-up of your retirement fund savings is exempt from tax too.
Okay.
And then when you eventually retire or take the money out, when you withdraw, the money is going to be taxed in some way. Not all countries work this way. You can have tax being paid up front, so that's where you don't get a tax subsidy on your contributions into your retirement funds. And there are various pros and cons to the various systems. But what we have as of today is an exempt tax system. Now, from the government's point of view, they're actually giving you money when you contribute into your retirement fund.
Yeah.
Yes, and that's called a tax expenditure subsidy.
Okay.
So in the same way as some people get money from the government when they've claimed their old age grant, you as a saver in your occupational fund are getting money from the government in terms of the tax expenditure subsidy. And as we all learned from economics 1, there's no such a thing as a free lunch.
No, there is not.
So the fact that you're getting this tax expenditure subsidy means that there are certain requirements placed upon you. Government expects certain things from you. And one of the things they expect from you is that you're going to use this money for your retirement so you don't get a government grant.
Yeah, so that you're not dependent on them, that you can support yourself.
Exactly. So, it's not like we just give money to some people through grants and give nothing to others. We actually are giving everyone money for their retirement.
Yeah, just via a tax mechanism.
Except for people who don't pay tax, which is a separate conversation. So, for that reason, government's gotten stricter over time in terms of what people do with money they get out of their retirement benefits. Sorry, in terms of what they get out of their retirement funds. So, up until relatively recently, if you were in a provident fund when you retired, you could take all your money out of retirement and blow it on a big party if that's what you really wanted.
So every single cent?
Every single cent. You could take 100% out if that's what you really wanted. You could also put 100% of it in an annuity.
Yes, so you could be responsible with it, but it was kind of up to you.
You could take it out. Remember, I spoke earlier about the trade unions and about, how funds worked under apartheid. A lot of the provident funds came from migrant workers who were going to be retiring back to the homelands.
Yes.
Where they weren't necessarily developed financial services markets, where you weren't necessarily going to be able to have access to an annuity. So that's...
They wanted the whole lump sum so they could take it and go back.
Because an annuity was useless.
Yes.
Because you wouldn't necessarily have access to a bank account. So... that's where the provident fund model was quite useful to people. Now, obviously, over time, financial services have become more inclusive and people now have access to bank accounts. And, so in theory, people should be able to purchase these annuities, which hopefully reflect the risks that they represent, which is another conversation. And so government has now said, right, you can take a maximum of 1/3 out at retirement in cash. The rest has to go into an annuity, which means...
sorry to interrupt you, is there science to that 1/3 or is it fairly arbitrary?
I think it's fairly arbitrary. I think it's something that we've inherited.
Okay.
And that we've just rolled with.
Okay.
In time. So I think that's a great research question, is where that's from and what is the right number. But at the moment, it's 1/3, 2/3 for everyone.
Okay.
So historically, what happened is in these provident funds, you were able to take everything out. And as a result, provident funds were taxed differently in terms of the contribution.
Yes.
But the contribution tax changed first. And then we changed what people were able to do on annuitization. And then now we're in the process of changing what people are able to do on withdrawal. So prior to this, if you changed employer, you could take everything out of your fund.
Yes.
Which was fine because not everyone who loses their work actually is going on to another job, and some people actually have real need for that money when they change jobs. So now we're moving on to a system where a third of your contributions are going to go into some sort of pot which is accessible before you reach retirement age. If you lose your job, you can take all of that out.
Okay.
Or if you just have a crisis, like during the year, so unexpected medical bills, you can take money out of that pot only once a year and use that for whatever it is that you feel you need that money for. But then 2/3 of your contributions have to remain until you retire. So the difference right now between a pension and a provident fund is if you entered one tomorrow, there is absolutely no difference.
Sure.
The only difference that we have remains to historic benefits that people
Okay.
in those have.
And then last sort of term that I would like you to define or speak to is a preservation fund. So now that's also something that plays in the pension fund, but again, a different P word, but what does that mean?
Okay. So your let's talk about your occupational pension fund, which is what you have through your employer, and that could be an occupational pension fund or an occupational provident fund. So when you change employer, you obviously can't stay a member of that fund.
Yeah.
Or at least historically you couldn't. There are certain ways that you can. So when you left, you either had to move your money to a retirement annuity, which is something that you have in your own name, or you could move it to your new employer's fund. But there were certain times where you couldn't do that. So for example, you couldn't necessarily move money from a pension fund to a provident fund.
Okay.
So if you had a pension fund with your old employer, provident fund with your new employer, you couldn't move money. So enter into the market these things called preservation. So you have preservation pension funds and preservation funds. And your pension funds are there for preserving pension money.
Yes.
And your preservation provident funds are there for preserving provident fund money. And then you could just move your money into these pres funds where it would just sit until retirement. You couldn't ever put more money in.
Okay.
Even if you had, say, another job which you left, and you couldn't combine your preservation funds.
Oh, so technically you could have little pools of money all over the place.
Oh, absolutely, and people do, which is why it becomes quite difficult to actually measure how well the system is doing.
Yeah.
So you can't put more money into a preservation fund, but you could take money out.
Okay.
So if you suddenly had some sort of financial crisis, you could make a withdrawal from your preservation fund. It could be everything in your preservation fund.
Okay, so it didn't have that two-thirds.
You're
Okay.
free to take everything out if you really wanted, but you could only make one withdrawal.
Okay.
The problem with that rule is that then if someone thought they needed money, they might as well take it all out because
You don't know if you're going to need it again or...
Exactly.
Yes, exactly.
Basically. So preservation provident funds, I mean, we haven't had them forever. They were introduced way later on in the process.
Yeah.
And they're not perfect, but they exist, and they were a mechanism to allow people to try and preserve their money for retirement.
Very interesting. Very interesting.
I mean, I have one.
Yes, I also do. I know what you
sound quite bad.
I do too, because I've also changed jobs numerous times. So just such an interesting space. And would you, for young actuaries or young actuarial analysts who are sort of wondering where they should specialize, would you encourage them to look at pensions as a discipline? And why would you encourage them to do that?
I definitely feel it's a neglected discipline. I definitely think it's something that everyone should try.
Yeah.
Just like I feel that most disciplines are something that people should actually try and look at or work a rotation on at some point in their career, because you don't know what you don't know. And I think a lot of people have very set ideas of, I'm never going to work in pensions because I did one lecture on it in third year and I really neglected it. You don't really know until you're working there what it's like. And just like life insurance is a very, very broad discipline, and general insurance is a very broad discipline, and banking is very broad, and investments is very broad, pensions is very broad. So I would definitely encourage people to at least think about it, and I would definitely encourage people to do at least one rotation too. In the same way as I would encourage people to do something else, because actuarial science is very broad. In the same way as someone studies medicine, they could become a pediatrician or a GP or a psychiatrist. Actuarial science is the same. It's very, very broad, and you're likely to find a fit for you somewhere in that spectrum.
100%.
But you're not going to know it at once.
Yeah. Yeah. Even though as actuaries, we love knowing things in advance.
But sadly, you're not going to get the crystal ball. You're not going to get the neon sign. This is going to be one of those things where you just have to try on various things.
Yeah.
And